Hey, it's me again. This time we're looking at the first time that they do the backstory for Professor X and Magneto. And it was actually written by Chris Claremont and drawn by Dave Cockrum. And I want to talk about Dave Cockrum for a second. He actually helped create the looks of a lot of the popular X-Men characters in the 70s. And that's something that a lot of people who don't know the comics don't know. All the popular characters from the movies like Storm, Wolverine, Rogue, they were all not created by Stan Lee. And actually, the Rogue didn't even come about till well after Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, and Nightcrawler were created. So, and she started off a villain. Some of you might not know that. Rogue started off a villain. Anyway, in this comic, and I won't talk about the story of the actual plot line that had been running in the comics. I just want to talk about the flashback scene, which the comic takes most of that up. And anyway, let's dig into Uncanny X-Men number 161 and see how Professor X and Magneto met.
Let's talk about this cover. It is actually very good. You have in the background is Baron von Strucker, who some of you might know from both the end credit scene of Captain America the Winter Soldier and from Avengers Age of Ultron, the movie, who sadly gets killed off screen. Anyway, this is a good cover. And just to let you know, that's supposed to be Professor Xavier on the left with a woman named Gabby who will be in the story, and Magneto in his classic look. Although he doesn't actually wear that in this actual comic. He doesn't get that till later, but it's still a good image. And now I'm skipping to the flashback scene where Professor Xavier ends up meeting this guy here, and he says, Daniel Shamron. And so he and this guy talk for a while about all these different things, and he talks about a patient he has named Gabby. And then we meet Magnus, who, as you might guess, is Magneto, or will be after these events happen. And Professor X in this next panel actually thinks to himself and suspects that this guy might be a mutant, since he can't read his mind and he seems to have blocks to prevent anyone from scanning his mind. And so he talks to Magnus, and he asks him where he was from. And he says, Auschwitz, I grew up there. And your family? I have no family, Dr. Xavier, anymore. And so we cut to the next scene where this girl Gabby is in a trance. Then Daniel asks him to help with this woman's condition, and he enters into her mind, and you see these images here that look pretty freaky. This is supposed to be him entering her mind. And so he enters further into her mind, and you see what looks like a giant monster. And I'm going to skip some of this so that it doesn't end up too long. And then you come across this weird image of this humanoid lizard creature with really long fangs, kind of like a saber-toothed tiger's. And then it shows this, what is supposed to be, I think, an image. This is supposed to be symbolic of Nazis. There's no around it. This is supposed to be symbolized a Nazi she met. And then we cut to the next panel where we have Gabby say, Mama, Papa. And then Magnus says, I don't believe it. And Daniel says, I prayed for a miracle, Charles, but this, what did you do? And he says, what comes naturally, Daniel? That's it, Gabby. Have a good cry. That's a darling. You're all right now. You're among friends. You're safe. help me put her to bed. Will you? I'm afraid this has been an ordeal for both of us. And so they put her in bed, and then Magnus, Professor X, and Daniel are talking. They are talking about the different images that Gabby saw, and he explains that all of them represent fear, and Daniel says that one of them is obviously from an SS officer. And so we cut to this next page where you see images of Magnus and Professor X and Gabby. And then we cut to Magnus and Charles talking. He says to Charles, Charles, you are an idealistic fool. If mutants exist, and out of that fear try to destroy them, there is only one way to guarantee survival, to hold them superior, and that is for them to hold the reins of power. And then later he's with Gabby talking to her, and yeah, he ends up kissing her. It's not exactly right, and it's kind of not so good, although he thinks maybe there's no harm in it, and it does make her feel better, so he allows it. And then they get attacked, and there's no way around it. These guys that you see here are Hydra, and everyone in Hydra is a Nazi. And so they fight the forces there that are protecting the area. And then, unfortunately, a bullet goes by Professor X and hurts him a tiny bit, but it only grazes the side of him. It goes past him and just slightly hits him. And so the Hydra guys kidnap Gabby, and then there's a big massive explosion. And then Magnus comes rushing out, and he says to Charles that he's hurt. And he's not seriously though, says Charles. My head hurts like the devil. Daniel comes up, and he tells them that they have a prisoner. But unfortunately he refuses to talk. And then we cut to this really kind of creepy image of a close-up of one of the Nazi commander's eyes. And we see this is at a place where there's a waterfall and a bunch of army trucks. And yeah, you see the symbol there. Yeah, that's the Hydra symbol. And so we cut to the next panel where these Hydra agents are talking, and they have Gabby. And then we see Baron von Strucker here, and he says, because it is good news, and because of your youth, we shall overlook your disgraceful lack of discipline this time. Repeat, this transgression, however, and I shall not be so forgiving. And so he talks about how they have sought her for a while because of some sick, twisted thing they want to do. And then we cut to Professor X and Magneto, who end up deciding that they should go after them. And they found out that it's Baron von Strucker, and he's the most wanted Nazi war criminal according to Charles. And then we cut back to Baron von Strucker going on about his Nazi philosophy that I'm just going to skip because it's too sensitive. And then we see this panel of him standing before a bunch of gold and bragging about how they're going to succeed. And he of course says, "Hail Hydra!" And so we cut to Professor X and Magneto, who have now gotten there, and they come to rescue Gabby. And Baron von Strucker, of course, says for his men to kill them. But Magneto uses his powers, and he ends up blocking the men. And then Professor X uses his powers on a bunch of the men so that they're incapable of following any of Baron von Strucker's commands. And then Magneto ends up telling them here that they need to get out. And then comes a part I really like. So get this, Baron von Strucker threatens Magneto with this large metal glove weapon that he's going to try to use on Magneto. And then he ends up trying to hit Magneto, but then Magneto says, "No, Baron, you will find me considerably harder to slay than your countrymen did my family at Auschwitz." And then, this is a satisfying scene. He uses his magnetic power to completely squeeze the metal glove weapon around Baron von Strucker's hand so that he breaks his hand. And he says, "Merely demonstrating my irresistible power, the ability to manipulate magnetic fields. Your precious claw is made primarily of ferocious metals that make it particularly vulnerable." And then he uses his power to just toss Baron von Strucker aside. And of course, Baron von Strucker goes on about how that he's not going to destroy him. And so then we cut to this scene where, I'm not kidding, he's stealing all of Baron von Strucker's gold with his powers. And he ends up taking all the gold, flying out, and it seems to be implied that Baron von Strucker is going to die. He, of course, doesn't die, as he becomes a big villain in the comics later. And I've got to go ahead and say it, even though it's not related to this comic, that it's a shame they killed him off in Avengers Age of Ultron. He really was a good villain, but for whatever reason, they just didn't want to use him in the movies. And so we cut to this next scene, and it's a satisfying scene. Look at that massive amount of gold. And I'm going to go ahead and say it. Magneto uses this gold to fund his Brotherhood. Yes, his Brotherhood was actually funded by gold he stole from Nazis. That is really satisfying. And so we cut to Magneto, who ends up saying to Charles, "You are far too trusting, Charles. Too naive. You have faith in the essential goodness of man. In time, you will learn what I have learned, that even those you love will turn from you in horror when they discover what you truly are. Mutants will not go meekly to the gas chambers. We will fight, and we will live. Farewell." And Professor Xavier's like, "Magnus, no!" And then he talks to Gabby, and they are about to kiss, and that's the end of the flashback.
This comic is actually pretty good, and it is a good story of how Professor X and Magneto met. I also like the Baron von Strucker appearance there, and that Magneto broke that zombie's hand and stole all his gold. That's pretty good, and used it to fund the Brotherhood. Unfortunately, next time I'm going to be looking at something that isn't so good. In fact, it's not good at all. The top 6 things I dislike about One More Day, and I'm also going to be talking about One Moment in Time. See you then. Hey, oh shoot.